Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome SAME President and fellow SAME, Mike Blunt.
Hey, welcome everybody. You probably can't see from there, but I have to use teleprompters. And the only reason I'm using them is that Ann McLeod promised extra drink tickets if I did. So find me tonight and I'll have extra drink tickets. A shout out for Sean, who's running the teleprompter behind, because I'm probably like Ron Burgundy. I'm going to read whatever the teleprompter says. I went back to Sean with some edits, and he had them all. I was truly amazed. He had everything already done because he read through my script and fixed it. So in a minute, I'm going to get on the teleprompter. So for the people right there and right there, I'm not looking at you. I just want to let you know that. This tie, I wear this in honor of Ed Curtis and Ron Hertwig and all our brethren who came from the great state of Hawaii. In fact, will everyone who came from Oconus stand up? How about a big hand for the folks who really traveled? And before I jumped on the teleprompter, folks who know me are always scared to give me the microphone because they're afraid I'll talk about the University of Florida. But I'm not going to, even though we're in Columbus, the home of Ohio State University, which Florida beat for the national title in football and basketball in the same calendar year. But I'm not going to talk about the Gators, even though I have the microphone. All right, Sean, I think we're ready to go. So welcome to Columbus, a great venue for a conference. I have to say I'm excited about JETC this year. We have 70 concurrent educational programs over the next few days. We've increased the sessions each year, and this year is no exception. I'd personally like to thank the session speakers and moderators. I know it's not easy to share your time like that and expertise. What an opportunity to take your professional development to a different level. And that's what we're about in SAME. We're about personal and professional development. And you need to remember that when you go forward and talk to your bosses and your senior leaders, especially the uniformed services. It's all about your professional development. I don't want to forget those who served on the abstract review committees. We had over 150 abstracts to review for this conference. They did a fantastic job picking the right ones, and it's not an easy task. How about a big round of applause for the folks who set your programs up? It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Eileen Collins, an American astronaut, retired Air Force colonel, and the first female pilot to command an American spacecraft. As Joe mentioned earlier, this is the 20th anniversary of her flight on the Space Shuttle Atlantis. We are lucky to have her with us, given the timing. As a child, Eileen dreamed of becoming a pilot. Her parents nurtured her dreams by often taking her to Elmira's soaring fields to watch the gliders take flight. She read every book she could on aviation. Eileen began saving money for flying lessons at the age of 16. After graduating from Syracuse University, Eileen entered the Air Force undergraduate pilot training program. And in 1990, she was selected for NASA's astronaut program. And in February 1995, on STS-63 Discovery mission, she became the first woman to ever pilot a space shuttle. She piloted STS-84 Atlantis in May of '97, and in July of '99, she achieved another milestone, which became the first woman ever to command a shuttle mission, STS-93 Columbia. After flying one final NASA mission in July of 2005, as commander of STS-114 Discovery, Eileen retired. Now that she's realized her dreams of becoming both a pilot and an astronaut, Eileen has a new dream, that someday people discover new ways to fly higher, faster, and further. And that someday we will travel beyond our own solar system. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the screen for a short video. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to begin with a story. On February 1st of 2003, my crew was 5 weeks from launch. So we had been working hard, we were really excited, we were ready to go. Well, February 1st was, that day was a Saturday. It was important because that was the day that the Space Shuttle Columbia was returning from its 2-week mission. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up my son, who was 2 years old at the time, and we were sitting on the living room couch. We had the NASA TV going, and the crew had done the deorbit burn. And by the way, everything had been going perfect during this mission. A lot of people didn't even know there was a space shuttle in orbit because things had been going so well. But they did the deorbit burn, and they started coming home, and I knew something was wrong when the crew stopped answering the radio calls from Mission Control. So Houston was calling a Columbia comm check. Columbia, how do you read? And there was no answer. And then I knew something was terribly wrong when the radar controller in Florida said that he did not have a radar return on the space shuttle. I remember my heart started beating very hard. I started changing channels, and I found a major news station showed burning debris across the sky. So 7 astronauts gone, and our Space Shuttle Columbia gone. How could that have happened? We had no idea that there was a problem. So that day, NASA put together an accident board, and over the next several months, the accident board figured out the cause of the accident. The physical cause of the accident was the presence of a hole. So this hole was about 4 to 6 inches, and it was underneath the left wing, kind of on the leading edge, underneath, where the crew couldn't see it. So nobody knew that damage was there. When the shuttle returns, it heats up to almost 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, various temperatures outside, but basically a plasma forms around when you return from orbit, because you're going 25 times the speed of sound, 18,500 miles an hour over the surface of the Earth. You heat up. That's why you've got to have a heat shield coming back from orbit. Well, there was a breach in the heat shield, so this plasma got into the wing, and it melted the aluminum structure of the wing, and the wing broke off. And that was the physical cause of the accident. Well, the next question is, how did that hole get there? Well, it was determined later, we found out that on launch day, 2 weeks prior, a piece of foam fell off the fuel tank. So the shuttle fuel tank is full of cryogenic hydrogen and oxygen, so you need to insulate it with this foam. And it sort of looks like your picnic cooler, very lightweight. But this piece that fell off the tank was about 2 feet long. It weighed less than 2 pounds. But you know what momentum is. It was going fast enough that it was able to do damage. And that's how the hole got there. And so more on that later. But the thing I'm going to talk about today is not just the space shuttle, but the accident board said that just as much to blame as the physical cause of the accident was the culture at NASA. And that was a hard pill to swallow because I thought I worked in the best culture in the world at NASA. Great mission, great people, we all loved what we did, but the accident board blamed the culture at NASA. So after the accident, NASA took on a huge challenge. We not only had to fix the problems that caused the accident, but we had to get the space shuttle flying again. We had to build the International Space Station. Our goal was to have that built by 2010. And then replace the shuttle with the next generation launch vehicle. We're still working on that. But my crew was asked to stay on and fly the next mission. And it ended up taking 2.5 years, but over those 2.5 years, before we actually flew the next shuttle flight, we gradually learned more about the accident. So I want to talk about what we learned in the area of leadership and the challenges that we face there. But before I talk about the lessons learned, I think any talk on leadership, and I'm going to try to go through this quickly, I think any talk on leadership needs to include the traditional or classic principles of leadership that you all learned in college or you learned maybe in your first assignment in the military. And I'm going to touch on that briefly. What I remember learning in my years in ROTC was the 3 basic principles of leadership were knowledge of your job, working well with people, and integrity. And NASA the Space Shuttle program did all those very well. I know I'm a little bit preaching to the choir here, but knowledge of your job, knowing your job, doing your job, excellence, competence in everything that you do. As a shuttle commander, I know that what I know can save my life, and that's a message I want to get across to my crew. We study something every day. We run simulations. We run challenging simulations. We compete with each other in our knowledge. We want to be the best that we can be. And I felt the shuttle program engineers and managers were the same. Working well with people, knowing the people that you work with. If you have customers, knowing your customers, not just their names and what their job is, but knowing what are their interests, what are their family situation, do they have special needs, communicating well by caring. And the space shuttle crew we train together for so long, we can almost see into each other's heads. The tasks that we do are too complex to be doing alone. So you can almost predict what your crew member is going to do. And I believe that the Space Shuttle program was also good at working as teams. And the third, last but not least, is integrity, which most of us think is honesty, but it's also more than that. It's, I believe, predicting, knowing that the person that you work with will be honest with you in the future. Then you feel that person has integrity. And in an organization, it's not keeping secrets from each other. You have to share critical knowledge and having standards, maintaining them fairly. And when it comes time to make a decision, it's important for me to know that my people know I made the decision in the best interest of the mission, not because I have personal gain. And that's the way I see integrity. And I feel like the shuttle team did these things very well. So when the accident boards blamed the culture at NASA, I thought, where are they coming from? So the report came out, and I want to go over what happened on launch day, because this is important to know. When the space shuttle launches, most launch vehicles, there's cameras all around the launch pad, and they track the launch vehicle, and those videos are reviewed after the flight to see if there's anything abnormal. Well, the engineers down at the Cape saw the foam. They actually saw at 81 seconds in the ascent, they saw the foam fall and hit the wing. But their view was an angle from the top of the wing. They didn't actually see the bottom of the wing, but they saw this foam hit, and it kind of turned into a bunch of powder. It sprayed out. And they thought, we think there's damage. So they did the paperwork, and their goal was to ask the Air Force to turn their satellites in orbit, if they could, photograph the shuttle and see if there's any damage, so we would know. Well, due to a variety of communication mix-ups and organizational mix-ups, who's in charge of what, misunderstandings, the request was withdrawn. And even after the Air Force started working on it, the request was withdrawn, and the pictures were never taken, and we never saw, and we never knew. And this all came out after the accident. Now, had we known that there was a hole in the wing, it was determined afterwards that NASA could have launched a rescue mission. So the Space Shuttle Atlantis, which was at the time, was stacked. We would have had to roll it out. We would have flown the previous crew that had flown the prior mission, because they were the best trained, send up 4 astronauts, do a rejoin, a Beta Bay rendezvous with Columbia, do a spacewalk and take spacesuits over to Columbia for those astronauts, and then the 7 Columbia astronauts come back on Atlantis. I believe the country would have been riveted. This would have been a rescue mission that the whole planet would have been watching. And I believe it had a very good chance of being successful. But it was never flown because we never knew. So the accident board, by the way, we couldn't have saved Columbia because Columbia was damaged they could have set the switches to do a deorbit burn, and they could have burned up Columbia out over the ocean somewhere. But you could have saved the astronauts. So the accident board blamed missed opportunities on faults in the organizational culture. So I want to quickly read a definition of how they define culture. The accident board said, organizational culture refers to the basic norms, beliefs, and practices of an institution. At the most basic level, organizational culture defines the assumptions that employees make as they carry out their work. It defines the way we do things here. We all know that. So culture's not a good thing or a bad thing. I believe it's just something that we need to be aware of. And you don't want that to be the driver of all your decisions. So I made a list of some of as you read through this report, and if you ever want to read the Columbia accident report, it's online. It's on the NASA website. You can search for it. You can read chapter 6, which is the emails that were going back and forth. Among other things, it's quite interesting. I believe everybody, especially in the space program, should read that report when they're new in the industry. But there were several types of flawed thinking that were going on, and I wanted to go over those with you. And I'm not pointing fingers at other people. This is very important to me because I know that I'm susceptible to this kind of thinking. And had I been in those positions, it could have very well been me. So the types of flawed thinking, the first one was the expert on at least the way I saw it, the expert on this heat shield said to me, a lightweight piece of foam cannot put a hole in my heat shield. Can't be done. It's impossible. So this was proven wrong later because NASA, the accident board, went out to Southwest Research Institute and set up a ground test apparatus, and they actually fired a piece of foam, similar weight, at a test article of the leading edge of the wing, and they blew a hole in it. And they called that the smoking gun. If you think about momentum, if something's lightweight, if it's going fast enough, it can definitely cause damage. So is that a lack of creative thinking? I don't know. But I do believe that experts can still learn, even if you are the expert on a system. I don't have time to go into all the other details, but there's actually more engineering details that if you're interested, you can read in the report. The second type of flawed thinking is current software models showed that minimum or no damage would occur from launch debris. So the model that was being used was called Crater. And Crater actually was not a bad model. In fact, they continued to use Crater after the accident. The problem was it was not tested against real-world data. It was analysis. So your confidence level in your model will go up as you do testing, and we hadn't done any testing. So it really wasn't appropriate to be letting the model tell you what to do. You can use it as a tool in decision-making, but it should not be the absolute answer. The third type of flawed thinking, it's never happened before, so it can't happen now. So people will take greater and greater risks with a certain anomaly as you keep, I'm going to say, dodging bullets. And a good example of this is the Challenger accident, which was the first space shuttle accident, happened back in 1986. They were having burn-throughs of the O-rings in the boosters. And this happened on many, many missions before we lost Challenger. There was a book written after the accident by a sociologist named Diane Vaughan, and the book is called The Challenger Launch Decision. And she coined a term, normalization of deviance. So you have a system that is supposed to operate a certain way, but it's not. It's doing something else that wasn't predicted, but the O-rings were getting blown through, and heat was leaking out. It wasn't supposed to do that, but it was. And after a while, they started thinking, well, I guess it must be okay. And it wasn't. So the normalization of deviance, that happened in the Columbia accident also because we have had foam falling off since the very first flight. The fourth type of flawed thinking, another top manager said, if we knew there was a hole in the wing, there's nothing we could have done about it. So how many times do we say that? I mean, I honestly will never say there's nothing that can be done. Because sometimes if you trust your people to be creative, maybe they will surprise you. And there was something that could have been done. The Monday morning quarterbacking said a rescue mission could have been flown. So trust your people to be creative. And the fifth type of flawed thinking, if you can't stand the answer, don't ask the question. Really, don't take the pictures, because if we see there's damage, we don't know what we're going to do. So those are some of the types of thinking that the accident board had pointed out. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not pointing fingers, because the people that were involved were all good, smart people, and nobody wanted an accident to happen. But when you are working in a very, very risky mission, you've just got to be better. And the three lessons learned is, I believe we can be better listeners, I believe we can be more humble, and I believe we can be more creative. And I'm going to briefly touch on each one of those, because they may not be what you're thinking. So being a better listener. So right now you're listening. I call that passive listening. But there's active listening, I think, that is something that we should all do, whether we're running the program or if we're taking part in some other part of the program. We can be better listeners. We obviously at NASA have budget pressure, we have schedule pressure, and sometimes that overwhelms us. But I believe that you go out there, keep that in mind, because obviously those are constraints that we have to work with, but active listening, go out and talk to your people. Ask them, what do you think? After the accident, one of our managers changed the way he held meetings, because the accident board blamed the silent safety culture that sat along the wall in meetings and wouldn't speak up. This manager said, we're not going to operate that way. If you're coming into my meeting, you have to say something. And when the meeting's over, if I haven't heard from you, I'm going to call on you, because you are important. Whether you've been here for 1 month or 10 years, you are important. And that was a good technique, I thought, that I learned from him and adapted. And one of the things I think we can do as engineers or astronauts is go out and visit the factories and ask people, how are things going here? What can we do better? Does this idea make sense to you? Go out and actively listen, actively seek out what other people are thinking. And that's tied into the second issue, which is humility. And I think a lot of people misunderstand humility. I don't think it's being quiet and shy, and sitting off in the corner. I think it's more of a confident humility, where even though I'm the boss, I can listen and I'm not threatened by what people are telling me. Maybe my way's not the only way. Maybe I can give other people's ideas a chance. You can even say to people, that's a great idea, even if you know I'm probably not going to use the idea, but you don't want to stifle people's creativity. And I find that these type of leaders are so confident in themselves that they can be good listeners and they're still in control. And they don't feel threatened by what's going on around them. And that leads into the final lesson learned, which is creativity. So there's creativity in your daily thinking, which, we do simulations as astronauts, and we make it hard. We force our crews into making mistakes so they can be humble and maybe learn a better way to do something, be more creative. Ask, what can make us fail? What can hurt us? How can we do this better? So that's daily thinking, but there's another form of creativity, which is when you are assigned a job to go out and be creative, and that we call innovation. So after the accident, we had to innovate in many areas. One of them was we had to stop foam from falling off the fuel tank. That turned out to be much harder than we thought, because we continued to have foam falling off the fuel tank right up until the last flight, but we were able to stop the large pieces from coming off. If we did have damage on a future shuttle flight, we had to create a way to repair damage. And you'll see, I'm going to show a video here, and you'll see some of the testing that we did. So there were several techniques that were developed to repair damage in the heat shield. And we also had to figure out how to discover that we had damage or how to inspect. And this is where a young engineer came up with this great idea. We came up with several ways to do an inspection. We had a robot arm, we put cameras on the end. But I was in a meeting with the rendezvous section. And just to give you some background on how the space shuttle rendezvous with this, or any, I would say, approaching vehicle docks with the space station. Okay, you've got the station up here, the shuttle comes in from below, stops at 600 feet, and then it flies up to what we call the V-bar, and it comes in vertically and docks. So this young engineer presented his idea in a meeting, and he said, when the shuttle comes up from below and stops at 600 feet, before you do your fly-up, why don't you pitch around the shuttle, do a 360 pitch around, expose the shuttle's bottom side, the tiles and the heat shield, to the crew on the space station. They can take pictures, digital photos, and downlink those, and we can look at those and see if there's any damage. And somebody said, you can't do that. There's a flight rule that says the astronauts can't lose sight of the target. And if they flip around, they're going to lose sight of the target. And so then they start going, well, we wrote the flight rule. We can rewrite the flight rule. We can write an exception to it. But you know what my thought was? And I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but this is, I think, a lot of us think this way. I sat there going, you know, that's a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? And this is where I had to say, you know, that's a great idea. I think we can try it. So we, along with the rendezvous section, wrote a procedure. We practiced it in the simulator, and every flight since then has used this maneuver called the RPM, Rendezvous Pitch Around Maneuver. And you'll see that in the movie, which we'll show here in a minute or so. So listening, humility, creativity, they all contribute to a more disciplined team with a sense of responsibility for the mission and respect for those that we work with. So what I'd like to do is, why don't we go ahead and roll the movie? And I'm just going to narrate through this. We actually flew the mission 2.5 years later. It was very successful. And I'm just going to go through from flight day 1 to it was a 15-day flight. So my crew was in quarantine for 3 weeks, medical quarantine to keep us from getting sick. Launch morning, we head out to the pad 5 hours before, strap in, run the checklist, watch the clock countdown. The main engine's light, T-minus 6.5 seconds. When the main engines are up to speed, the booster's light, and we're off the pad. We finally got the shuttle back in space again after 2.5 years. So you see we pass the top of the tower. We're already going over 100 miles an hour. We roll out over the ocean. You can see over here on the right side, you can see the beach. This is the shuttle at the top. There's the orange fuel tank at the bottom. You can see the wing. So we had cameras, new cameras, all over the outside of the stack looking for any damage that might happen. We also had the cameras on the solid rocket boosters. Those are very bumpy. It's a very, very bumpy ride. You shake around a lot with the boosters, but at 2 minutes they separate, and then you have a very smooth ride. We achieve up to 3 Gs. So what does that mean? If you weigh 100 pounds on Earth and you stood on a weight scale during the launch, you would register 300 pounds. That's 3 Gs of acceleration. So we separated from the tank, got out of our suits. We fly the shuttle on orbit manually. We did a series of burns because on flight day 3, we're going to rendezvous and dock with the space station. So here's that RPM, Rendezvous Pitch Around Maneuver I mentioned. You can see under the shuttle, we actually saw that we did have some minor damage. There were these 2 pieces of, they're like cardboard, but they're called gap fillers that had popped out between the tiles. And we had to do a spacewalk later to remove those. This is how the space station looked back then. The orange is the solar arrays. This long part down the center is the living area. Here's the end of the docking. This also was flown manually, but we worked together as a team. Dock with the space station very slowly, going 0.1 foot per second. We equalized the pressure, An hour later, we opened the hatch. The commander of the space station at the time was Sergei Krikalev. The Russians and the Americans exchanged the commander of the space station. My crew is in the dark blue. The space station crew is in the light blue. Sergei Krikalev is on the left. John Phillips is on the right. John was the science officer. He's the geologist. And they had been up there for, I believe, 4 months or so. And John kept calling us in the office, telling us, look at him. Look what's in his hands. You know, that's his coffee. So he kept calling us, don't forget my coffee. And because they had run out of, the shuttle wasn't flying. They had run out of all kinds of supplies, but all he wanted was coffee. This is the U.S. laboratory. This is Andy Thomas and Wendy Lawrence moving. It's very easy to move things in space. You just float them. Nothing weighs anything. So, but it's easy to lose. Things will float away. You have to put Velcro on everything. This is Soichi, and behind him is Steve Robinson. They're both aerospace engineers. They went out on a spacewalk on flight day 5, 7, and 9. And meanwhile, Jim Kelly and Wendy flew the robot arm. So in this view, you see the robot arm, which, by the way, is made in Canada. And they moved our logistics module out of the shuttle and put it on the space station. Soichi and Steve went out on their very first spacewalk. I know they were both nervous because they have all these medical leads attached to them, and their heart rate goes like way up when they're getting ready to go out and do their first spacewalk. And I went in to help put their helmets on, and I had to give them like a word of wisdom. I said, now boys, you only have 6.5 hours. You need to be back in time for dinner. And they loved it because, you know, I tell people the best training to be a shuttle commander is to be a parent, because you learn how to be firm and don't let them push back. It's all for your safety. So this is Soichi on the end of the robot arm, and he changed out a control moment gyro with CMG. It weighs 600 pounds on Earth, but in space it's weightless. So he was able to hold that in his hands for 45 minutes. There he is on the end of the arm. He was able to hold that CMG control moment gyro while Wendy moved him from the shuttle up to the station. They did the change out and brought the broken one back home. There, if you look, I'm on the right screen over here, that big black thing is almost as big as he is, and he was able to hold that effortlessly. And you also have a tether on it in case you accidentally let go. And if you look here in the center, there's his feet attached to the arm, and he's upside down with, look over here, okay, there's his feet right there, and there's the control moment gyro. That whole operation took 6 hours. Now, Steve is on the end of the robot arm here, and you see he's under the space shuttle. So the third spacewalk, we had him pull out those gap fillers that had popped out. They're only needed for launch to prevent vibration on the tiles against each other. So if you look at his right hand, he's pulling out that, it looks like a white piece of cardboard. And that red stuff is a glue that failed. So down at the Cape, they didn't change the glue for future missions, but they changed the process of how you apply it to prevent that from happening. The engineers were worried that if those gap fillers popped out, they could damage the tiles downstream, or they could even pull the tile out, which would not be good. And there's Andy and Steve and Soichi showing we downlinked the gap filler, just a shot of the gap fillers. On flight day 9, we did the goodbye ceremony, and we signed the logbook. You put your sticker on the wall and you sign the logbook to say you were there. And we undocked. Jim Kelly, my pilot, flew the separation and fly around. This is a view of the space station. Again, the solar arrays. All the power comes from the sun. Here's the radiators for cooling. And again, the long tube is the living area. Back then it was about the size of 5 school buses end to end. Now the space station today is more than twice the size of that. So we said goodbye to our crew. We went on and did a couple more days of our mission. Flight day 15, we came home. We do a series of deorbit burns. These guys are just clowning around here. Their job was over, so I had to kind of keep them under control. This is our sleeping bags. wanted to show my kids how you sleep in space. So you can put your sleeping bag anywhere. You can put it on the ceiling, the wall, anywhere. Okay, here we're heading back home. If you can see there out the window, you can see the plasma buildup. And this is an infrared view. We did not land in Florida. It was July and there was too many thunderstorms. So we came down to Edwards Air Force Base in 5 o'clock in the morning. Our final approach here, you can see the heat on the nose in the wings. So we come down final about 7 times steeper than a commercial airliner. As you know, we have no engines, so we manage our energy with the speed brake. We land about twice the speed of a commercial airliner. We have a drag chute, and coming back it's really challenging for the pilot. So the space shuttle has always been landed by the commander. We tried twice to do an auto land, and the system was just not very good, so we continued doing all of our approaches and landings manually. The pilot flies those. And the challenge is you've been in space for usually 2 weeks, and you're deconditioned to Earth's gravity. So when you come home, you could imagine you got a 40-pound parachute on your back, and you're being like pulled down in your seat. You got your helmet on, and you just feel very, very heavy, and the way you fly feels just a little bit different. So many of the engineers worried about, is the crew going to be able to land safely after being deconditioned, being up in space? So we, as pilots, worried about that also. It turned out it wasn't a problem. In the future, when we have crews coming back after 6-month or 1-year missions, we believe we should automate the landings because there's so much different going on, the way your inner ear feels and just the way the control system feels. When the astronauts get out of the shuttle or the Soyuz, now we go up and back on the Russian Soyuz, it is very difficult to stand up. Not only are you feel extremely heavy and you're wondering, why are my feet stuck to the ground? It really feels strange to have your feet stuck to the ground, even though you grew up on planet Earth and your feet have always been attached to the ground. It feels more natural to be up in space. You have that heavy feeling, but you also have a feeling of lightheadedness because all the blood rushes down to your feet, and it can be very dangerous if you have an emergency. So these are all things that we're working on countermeasures to help the astronauts when they come back from missions. So that gives you an idea of what our mission was like and being up in space. But with the few minutes that we have left, I'd like to show you some photos of the Earth from space, because I would say one of the most wonderful things about being an astronaut is being able to look back at planet Earth. And when you go up in space, you don't really want to look out at the stars. They look pretty much the same as they do from the surface of the Earth, except they don't twinkle because there's no atmosphere. But we would prefer to look back at the Earth. So I'd like to share with you just a few of those photos and talk to you about what it's like to be in low Earth orbit, because often people ask me what it was like to walk on the moon. Well, the shuttle never went to the moon. The moon is 3 days away, it's 220,000 miles away, and the space shuttle went to low Earth orbit, and the general public didn't always understand that. So I just want to go over a couple of photos of what we saw from space. You can see the curvature of the Earth at the top of this photo. That's down towards the South Pole, and you can see the horizon up there. That's about the size of the Earth that you see from the space shuttle, because we're up at about 200 miles, 150 to 350, in that range. And if you think about if you drove down the road 200 miles, that might take you a little over 3 hours. It's not that far, but that's where the distance that the space station is when it goes over top of your location on Earth. So this is the Southern Lights, the Aurora Australis. And the reason I like to show this photo is one of the risks that astronauts have in space is solar radiation. So when we're up in space, we don't have the protection of the atmosphere. Although we're under the Van Allen belts, we have a little bit of that protection. We are still exposed to radiation. So there's studies going on to see if astronauts get cancer at higher rates than the average population. We do know that astronauts have thyroid problems at a higher rate and cataracts at a higher rate. But we haven't made a conclusion on cancer yet. We kind of need a bigger population size. But this particular day, we were seeing the lights, which are caused by the solar particles interacting with the Earth's magnetic field. And I thought, wow, I wonder how much radiation we're getting. So I asked Mission Control, and they told me on a scale of 1 to 9, you're at a 7. But you don't need to take cover. We do have methods for, if there is a big solar storm, for the crew to take cover to protect themselves from radiation. So as we go into deep space in the future, one of the top concerns is protecting astronauts from radiation, because once you get outside of the Van Allen belts, like when the astronauts went to the moon, you are exposed to even more risk in that area. And NASA actually has limits on radiation. This is a wide-angle view, but you can see it's the state of Florida. So those of you from Florida would appreciate this. And you can see the beautiful blue of the Bahamas. But the reason I show this photo is I want to talk about the orbit, the altitude that we're at. So this picture, although it's a wide-angle view, we're at about 210 miles above the surface. So airplanes fly at about 7 miles, 40,000 feet or so, about 7 miles above the surface is where an airplane will fly when it's cruising. I mean, you could hike up to about 2 miles, 3 miles before you need supplemental oxygen. Airplanes fly at about 7 miles. You become an astronaut if you go over 50 miles. Well, the shuttle, in the suborbital flights that Alan Shepard flew, went to 62 miles. But John Glenn's flight went into orbit as the shuttles, 200 miles. Now, geosynchronous orbit, where a lot of these geostationary communication satellites are, it's like 22,000. Don't quote me on that, but it's roughly in that area. The moon is like 220,000 miles. Takes 3 days to get there. Mars, on the other hand, is 6 months away when the planets are on the same side of the sun. If the planets are on different sides of the sun, Mars is going on 2 years. That's why we have launch windows. We want to launch when we have the minimum travel time. So this is a photo of, it's Hurricane Rita, which was aiming right at Houston about a month after actually about 3 weeks after my crew returned. John Phillips was still on the space station, and he's looking at this, going right at Houston, which, by the way, it turned at the last minute and missed Houston. But he's worried about his family. He's worried about his home. There's challenges to being up in space for long periods of time, away from your family. And I showed this picture not to talk about hurricanes, but to talk about the psychological side of being in space. So NASA tries their best to make astronauts feel at home when they're up in space. So we initially, when we started doing long-duration flights, give the astronauts a close connection to planet Earth, which is like internet access, phone access. I mean, they could call your cell phone right now. You can't call them because you have security going up, but they can call anybody here. They don't need permission to do that. They have movies, they have books, they have pretty much all the creature comforts, but the main thing is connection with the family. So we were Skyping, everybody calls it Skype now, but we had that technology way back in the early days so they could see their families from their living room at home. I'm going to go quickly through these last couple because I want to do a conclusion here, but I'm not going to talk in depth on these, but I want to point out we work with scientists as we study the Earth. When we see fires burning, we photograph them and send them back. We did a coral reef study on one of my missions because scientists are studying the Earth's oceans. We work with them. This is the Madagascar river. It's the Betsy Boca River Delta. As Madagascar was being deforested, the astronauts would photograph the island and you could see how the erosion was happening. This is the Manicouagan crater, which is up in northern Canada. The scar is there from an impact, from an Earth-crossing object, maybe an asteroid, hundreds of thousands of years ago. We still see the scar. We know that the Earth has been hit in the past. There are people that actually are concerned about this, that are looking at ways to detect where these potential projectiles are, and then ways to divert them if we think they're going to hit the planet. This is the Himalaya Mountains. I'm just going to show you these next couple ones for fun. This is the Middle East, which is the most beautiful place to look at from space because it's almost always clear, no clouds, but the tan of the desert and the blue of the water is just strikingly beautiful. And you can see the Mediterranean Sea in the upper right, and you can even see the Nile Delta, which is connected to that. There's millions of people that live out there. There's the Sinai Peninsula, and you can see the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba, and at the bottom is the Red Sea. And in this next picture is Israel, and you can see cities from space because they look kind of gray. So the Dead Sea is this large lake, sea. If you go from the northern point just a little bit west, you can see Jerusalem. And then all the way down at the bottom, you see how the color changes down there in the bottom left? That's the border between Israel and Egypt, or the Sinai Peninsula. And some astronauts say you can't see borders from space, which is mostly true. But when my crew took a trip to Israel, by the way, there was an Israeli astronaut on the Columbia accident. So we got to know the folks over there very well. We asked them about that border, and they said that there's a difference in grazing patterns and agriculture between the two countries, and that's why you can see the border. When you look at things from space and they're straight, it's man-made. So this is the Suez Canal. If it's meandering, it's probably a river. And that's just a close-up view. That looks like something you might be able to take from an airplane, but the interesting thing is from space, you can put a long lens on your camera and you can zoom in and get very, very accurate detail. The problem is you're moving very fast, 17,500 miles an hour, so you have to have your computer telling you the time and exactly what angle to look at to get a photo like that. This is Hawaii, the Pearl Harbor, and down below Pearl Harbor is Diamond Head. See, there's Pearl Harbor on the right chart and Diamond Head. New York City in winter. I just wanted to point out right here on Manhattan is Central Park. I'm showing it on the left side, and you can see the Statue of Liberty is down there. And then this is New Jersey over here. I got to use my New York accent. The Great Lakes, I tell people that when you look out the window from the shuttle, north is not always at the top, so you have to study atlases upside down and right and left, so you can see I'm on the right or the left chart now. There's Chicago, there's Detroit, and over here on the right chart, here's Chicago, and here's Detroit over here, and then of course you got Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario lakes. That was in August. I'm sure everybody knows what this is. Boston Harbor, Cape Cod. You got Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. Over here, there's Boston, Cape Cod. Jerry Lininger, one of my crew members, took that photo. He's from the area. This is Greece. I'm just going to quickly go through this. I like to show pictures of Greece because I believe that the Greeks were explorers, and they explored the oceans the way we explore space now. And they took a lot of risks going out there. They didn't always know what they were going to find. Over here in the left chart, you got this was Sparta. This is Athens up here. And then, of course, the Aegean Sea in the middle is the Aegean Sea. I'm on the right, so there's Sparta and Athens. If you've studied the history of Greece, it's really fascinating, and I like to look at the parallels with what we're doing today. And my last chart is this is Italy. And you remember hearing about Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius, which is in Sicily, down here, and Mount Etna. And we study, actually there was a volcano that erupted in Mexico when I was up on my second mission, and we study those from space also. So I take lots of pictures of places I'd like to travel to someday. So that's a little bit of what the Earth looks like from space, and I believe space tourism is going to be very successful. Having been up there, the human side of just being in microgravity as well as looking back at the Earth is, and one of the funnest things to do is to put your face up against the window and stretch out your arms while you're looking down at the planet, and you feel like a Greek god flying over the planet. It's pretty cool. So I'm just going to conclude here with a couple of thoughts about the future. So a lot of people think that the astronaut program is over. It's not. The space shuttle stopped flying 6 years ago, but now our astronauts go to Russia. they train in Russia and they launch on the Soyuz and they return on the Soyuz, while the United States builds the replacement for the shuttle, which we are still building. So that's a different subject, but we want to do it safely, and it's got to be funded at the right level. So what is going on up there on the space station? You normally have 6 astronauts up on the space station from various countries. And by the way, we work extremely well with the Russians. We have been since 1993. So we're doing aeronautics research, technology development, Earth observation, human biology, and astrobiology. Astronauts have been on the space station continuously since the year 2000 with no interruption. And they're doing research on themselves. Astronauts volunteer their body for scientific research. We're also doing technology on closed-loop life support systems, solar energy, so the space station is completely solar. We actually sell some of our power to the Russians while they help us get up there and back. And we're learning how to live safely in space and efficiently so we can go to Mars someday. On the deep space side, Curiosity rover is on Mars. The little Opportunity rover, which was designed for 3 months, has been going for over 10 years. Still exploring the surface. And we have observatories like Hubble and Chandra, and now they're building the James Webb Space Telescope, which will look farther into space than the Hubble, and that's due to launch in a year or 2. And then where are we going with human spaceflight? It gets kind of confusing nowadays, but there's 3 categories. One of them is suborbital, which is private companies trying to sell their flights to private citizens so they can do suborbital up to 60 miles or so and come back. And those companies are charging their customers about $250,000, and they've got at least 250 people that have paid and are waiting to go. So NASA is supporting that, although it's all private. It's good for us because we share what we've learned. The other category is orbital, where the space station is, and that has been approved by Congress and funded through 2024. And NASA has certified it to 2028, although we still need the money to get out to 2028. And the third is the deep space, which is more like Apollo. So right now, NASA's building a space launch system that can launch 100 metric tons, 130 metric tons to send people someday to Mars. And NASA has a plan to land people on Mars in 2033. That's the plan. So I want to just conclude with a couple of thoughts. The United States put 12 people on the moon between 1969 and 1972. No other country has done that. So what's next? I talked about the horizon goal of sending people to Mars, and this can be done. Our biggest limit is the expense. It's very expensive to do this. And the other, propulsion-wise, we can do it, but the other problem is the life support systems, keeping people alive once they get there. So that's all being worked on. And as with the Columbia accident that I talked about, mistakes will be made, but the lessons that we learned from Columbia have to be applied to these missions that are talking about going to Mars. I believe going to Mars will be evolutionary as we build on what we learned, but I also believe that someday we need a revolutionary as opposed to evolutionary change in our propulsion systems, because as the Kepler telescope discovers planets and other solar systems, if we want to go there someday, you cannot do it with the current chemical propulsion. There has to be a new type of propulsion system developed. And I believe that someday somebody will figure that out, just like in the past someone figured out the printing press, the telephone, the car, computers, and rockets. Somebody will figure out a way to go faster into deep space. And it's important that we use our imagination for that. And I like this quote from Einstein where he said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge." So he said that, and you can think about it. And I believe that there are still many more discoveries ahead of us. So that's my conclusion. I want to thank you all for being such a great attentive audience. And before I leave, I want to thank Joe, wherever you went, and Mike and all of you for inviting me here, and wish you all luck in whatever you're doing. You have a very, very important mission. I am a huge supporter of engineering with young people, and I talk with young people about the importance of considering engineer. It's not for everybody, but that's where the discoveries are being made. So good luck to all of you. Thank you for what you do, and have a great week. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Collins, for being with us today. That was truly inspiring. I enjoyed every minute of it, especially all the pictures of the earth from far away. I also want to thank you for the service to our country. And many of the folks in here are veterans and appreciate everything you've done. The education sessions will begin at 2 o'clock. Please refer to the SME event app or program for all the details. Have a great afternoon. Hoorah.